Picture the pitch-black Atlantic in 1942. A German U-boat glides fearlessly across the surface. Confident in their impunity, the crew steps onto the deck. Engineers report on fuel levels, and the captain prepares for another hunt against British convoys. Suddenly, out of the darkness, a destroyer appears. Panic-stricken, the U-boat plunges into the depths, expecting the familiar rumble of depth charges. They hope to evade, but instead of the usual blast astern, dozens of shells erupt into the sky ahead of the destroyer. Like iron rain, they fall into the water in a checkerboard pattern. A moment later, a dull thud shakes the U-boat. A second of silence, then an infernal explosion, tearing the hull apart. The Germans didn't even have time to comprehend what happened. They were the first victims of a mysterious new weapon. What occurred that night marked the beginning of the end for the legendary German hunters of the Atlantic. The Allies had created not just a new armament, but a fundamentally different way to destroy submarines, which had previously seemed invulnerable. Today, we'll delve into how this Hedgehog came to be, why it received such an unusual name, and how it became a deadly nightmare for the enemy. If you want to know how a failing idea gave birth to one of the most effective anti-submarine weapons of the war, then you're in for some unexpected revelations. In 1939, with the outbreak of World War II, the British fleet faced a problem that couldn't be ignored. The formidable German U-boats had transformed into a true pack of hunters, tearing apart vital sea lanes. Convoys carrying supplies from America crossed the Atlantic under constant threat, and depth charges, which remained the primary anti-submarine weapon, were no longer delivering sufficient results. Submarines had learned to dive to greater depths, maneuver, and wait until a convoy was again unprotected. In this critical situation, a secret project was born deep within the British Admiralty. The leadership fully understood that the war could be lost not on the battlefields, but on the maritime routes, if German U-boats sank transports faster than new ships could be built. This is precisely why a special unit was created, the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. This unique structure employed not only military engineers, but also mathematicians, physicists, and even scientists who had no prior experience with the Navy. Their task was to devise a weapon capable of outsmarting the U-boat, forcing it to reveal itself, and destroying it with certainty. The initial steps were frankly disastrous. For instance, in 1941, a device called the Fairlie Mortar was tested. It was designed to fire ahead of the ship and drop charges directly in the enemy's path. However, the calculations proved incorrect, and the weapon resembled a chaotic fireworks display more than a deadly instrument. Sailors laughed at the experiment, and the skepticism of the officers only intensified. It seemed the idea had no future, but it was precisely from this failure that a solution emerged. Engineers decided to abandon complex systems and devise a new principle, not just dropping depth charges into the water, but launching a whole salvo of small charges forward, which would only explode upon contact with a solid surface. The idea seemed insane, but it turned everything upside down. This led to the prototype of the future weapon, later named Hedgehog. The name proved symbolic. A row of vertically protruding guide rails on the ship's deck resembled the sharp quills of the animal. Soon, this strange contraption transformed into a nightmare for German U-boat crews. But before that moment lay a long road of trials, doubts, and first battles, where the fate of the weapon was decided literally in seconds. This is what we'll discuss next. How this Hedgehog worked in practice, how it differed from depth charges, and why sailors initially viewed it with mistrust. To understand why the Hedgehog became a true revolution, you need to imagine what a classic depth charge attack looked like. An anti-submarine escort ship would pass over the approximate location of a U-boat and drop explosive barrels from its stern, set to a specific depth. But the problem was that by the time of the explosion, the U-boat almost always managed to maneuver away, and sonar operators would lose it in a blind spot. Too close beneath the ship, the sonar signal simply wasn't distinguishable. As a result, depth charges more often scared than destroyed the enemy. The Hedgehog, however, operated completely differently. Instead of dropping charges astern, the system launched a fan of shells, 24 or even more, forward of the ship. The shells fell into the water along a calculated trajectory, forming a circular pattern approximately 30 meters in diameter. Crucially, they didn't explode automatically. Each bomb detonated only upon contact with a solid surface, meaning the U-boat's hull. If a hit occurred, the result was instantaneous and deadly. Each such shell weighed around 30 kilograms and contained a powerful torpex explosive charge, which was almost twice as powerful as conventional TNT. A hit from even one charge could pierce a submarine's hull, and if several exploded at once, the U-boat would be torn to pieces. Furthermore, a Hedgehog salvo took only a few seconds, and reloading required no more than 3 minutes. In comparison, dropping depth charges was a lengthy process requiring precise depth calculation, which gave the enemy more time to escape. Another key advantage was that the weapon fired forward, meaning the ship could attack the enemy at the very moment acoustics were tracking it on sonar. The dangerous dead zone vanished, and the U-boat had no time to hide. In essence, this transformed submarine hunting from a high-stakes lottery into methodical destruction. But, as is often the case, theory and practice diverged. Early trials on warships demonstrated not only effectiveness, but also numerous difficulties. Sailors lacked experience with a new weapon. Misfires were common, and salvos weren't as accurate as desired. Even the captains themselves didn't trust the Hedgehog. For them, depth charges were a proven classic, and the strange battery of spikes on the deck only caused doubt. This is why the first months of combat deployment turned into a series of disappointments. In its early days, the Hedgehog system encountered numerous difficulties, becoming a severe test for both designers and sailors learning to use a completely new type of weapon. When these installations first appeared on British Navy ships, they were met with significant skepticism. Experienced officers accustomed to the roar of depth charges perceived the new system as something of a toy. Reports from that time indicated extremely low attack effectiveness, barely exceeding 5%, a result comparable to outdated bombs. Many captains outright refused to use the Hedgehog, citing that in the severe storms of the North Atlantic, the installations would be swamped with water, leading to short circuits and incomplete salvos. Sometimes, out of 4 charges, only half would launch into the water, while the rest remained in the launcher. Crews grew irritated, believing they had been saddled with an unreliable weapon. The Admiralty regularly received reports of the new weapon not being used due to bad weather, fear of missing, or a preference for depth charges. Soon, a special order was issued, obliging every captain to explain their reasons for not employing the Hedgehog when a submarine was detected. This step clearly demonstrated the British's deep faith in the potential of the new weapon, despite the sailors' reluctance to use it. The situation began to change. Specialized courses were organized for crews, teaching not only the technique of using the Hedgehog, but also new tactics for hunting submarines. Sailors learned that there was no longer a need to drop charges at random. It became possible to attack the enemy precisely when the sonar operator had a clear target. This required discipline and coordinated teamwork, but the results were quick to follow. Gradually, the first successful hits occurred, instilling faith in the new weapon. Several U-boats were destroyed with 1 or 2 salvos, and these stories quickly spread throughout the fleet. Skeptics became proponents, and for young officers, the Hedgehog began to be associated not with failure, but with a real chance of victory. However, precisely at this moment, just as the British were beginning to master the new weapon, the Germans made their move. Kriegsmarine U-boats received a deadly addition, the latest acoustic torpedoes, which homed in on the noise of destroyer propellers. Now, the hunters themselves were turning into prey, and the confrontation escalated to an entirely new level. By early 1943, the situation in the Atlantic remained extremely tense. The Germans continued to sink transports, the Allies suffered significant losses, and sailors were still learning to trust the Hedgehog. But it was at this moment that an event occurred that military historians would later call the turning point in anti-submarine warfare. After a series of failures, the Admiralty organized a large-scale retraining of crews. Commanders received new instructions. Attacks were now to be carried out exclusively using the Hedgehog, even if older methods seemed more reliable. Training exercises with submarine mock-ups were conducted at firing ranges, where crew actions were practiced until automatic. Sailors were taught to work in tandem. The sonar operator provided coordinates. The captain steered the ship precisely on course, and at that very moment, the salvo went forward, maintaining contact with the target. These efforts quickly bore fruit. Within a few months, the statistics dramatically changed. If previously only 5% of attacks were considered successful, now every fifth salvo resulted in the destruction of a U-boat. For comparison, depth charges hit their target in less than 1 out of 80 cases. The difference was enormous. The first real successes sparked a genuine shift in crew morale. Where skepticism once reigned, confidence now emerged. Sailors began to say that the Hedgehog allowed them to hunt U-boats as reliably as a predator takes down cornered prey. German U-boats increasingly failed to return to base, and reports of Kriegsmarine losses began to pour in one after another. The Germans also quickly realized what had happened. Their submarines, which for years had been considered the wolves of the Atlantic, suddenly found themselves the hunted. Kriegsmarine Command urgently deployed a new weapon, acoustic torpedoes, designed to home in on propeller noise. Now Allied destroyers were under threat. The torpedo flew directly towards their stern, even if the submarine didn't use its periscope. This was supposed to level the playing field. But the British were not about to give up. They began to employ clever maneuvers and special devices that created noise to throw the torpedo off course. And most importantly, they continued to hone their mastery of the Hedgehog. The German novelty was frightening, but it could no longer turn the tide of the war in the Atlantic. More and more attacks ended with the sinking of U-boats, and in the eyes of the Allies, the Hedgehog transformed into a symbol of victory. The Germans understood that their wolf packs were losing strength. The Hedgehog destroyed the submariners' main advantage, the ability to escape an attack by hiding at depth. But Kriegsmarine Command was not going to give up and threw a new weapon into the fray, acoustic torpedoes. These torpedoes, known to the Germans as Zonkenig or Rin, had a simple but insidious principle. They reacted to the noise of a destroyer's propellers. The submarine could launch them without even raising its periscope, and the torpedo would find its target, homing in on the sound of the propellers. The first encounters with these new torpedoes were a shock for the Allies. Several ships were lost. Sailors grew nervous, for now the hunter had become the hunted. Officers' memoirs recount descriptions of panic. The sonar operator would detect a submarine. The captain would prepare for a Hedgehog attack, and suddenly, the sonars would pick up a torpedo racing directly towards the ship's stern. There was no escape, as the destroyer was too close to its target. Everything came down to seconds. The Allies actively sought an effective countermeasure against this new threat. They began installing special noise-making devices, nicknamed Foxers, on their ships. These metal structures were towed astern, creating a powerful acoustic decoy in the water. The sound-homing torpedoes would most often veer off towards the Foxer, leaving the destroyer unharmed. Sailors quickly learned to combine the use of these decoys with a Hedgehog attack. While the torpedo was distracted by the noise device, the ship would execute a sharp maneuver and unleash its deadly forward salvo. For German submariners, this became a true nightmare. Their latest weapon wasn't delivering the expected breakthrough, while the Allies operated with increasing confidence. Every engagement now more frequently ended with the destruction of German submarines. The Germans themselves admitted that the Hedgehog undermined the crew's morale. The U-boat hadn't even had time to dive deep, yet explosions were already rocking its hull. The Kriegsmarine was losing its boats one after another. In desperation, the Germans intensified crew training, trying to find new tactics, but the situation was already turning against them. The Hedgehog had become a symbol of inevitable defeat in the Atlantic, and even the most experienced commanders began to understand that the war at sea was becoming hopeless. However, at the same time, on the other side of the world, in the warm waters of the Pacific, this weapon was about to prove itself with incredible force. There, one unassuming vessel, a small escort destroyer, rewrote the history of anti-submarine warfare, demonstrating that the Hedgehog could destroy submarines one after another, as if on a training exercise. It's the spring of 1944 in the Pacific. The war between the United States and Japan is entering its decisive phase. The Imperial fleet planned a grand battle designed to halt the American advance. To do this, the Japanese established a whole line of submarines, meant to warn of enemy approach and strike at convoys. But the Japanese had no idea that their plans would soon be shattered by one modest ship, the escort destroyer USS England. This ship was no giant of the fleet. Its displacement was only about 1,400 tons, and its crew numbered fewer than 200 sailors. It was inferior to larger destroyers in armament and protection, but it possessed one crucial asset, the Hedgehog system, which transformed it into a deadly hunter. On May 18, 1944, the USS England received orders to intercept the Japanese submarine RO-116, which was heading towards the Solomon Islands. The very next day, sonar detected the target. A tense game began. The destroyer tried to get into position for an attack, while the submarine maneuvered to escape. For times the Americans closed in, but each time the Japanese managed to evade. Tension mounted on board. Sailors feared the enemy would break contact and escape into the depths. But on the fifth attempt, something happened for which the Hedgehog had been created. The destroyer accurately came onto course. The salvo launched forward, and a few seconds later, a series of muffled impacts echoed underwater. Then followed a powerful explosion that lifted the ship's stern. The submarine was torn apart, debris and oil surfacing. Sailors cheered, and the commander recorded in the logbook, "With catastrophic certainty, we heard the end of another Japanese submarine." This victory was just the beginning. Just a few days later, the USS England would destroy another submarine, then another, and soon its name would become legend. In a short span, this small ship would become a record breaker, sinking 6 submarines in a row. After the victory over RO-116, the crew of the USS England felt the true thrill of the hunt. They held a weapon they had come to trust completely, and very soon, fate presented them with another chance to prove that their success was no fluke. On May 22, 1944, the destroyer received a signal. The Japanese submarine RO-106 was detected nearby. The ship set out for interception. That evening, sonar detected the target. The submarine was running on the surface, unaware of the danger. As soon as it spotted its hunters, it submerged instantly. But this time, the Japanese couldn't hide. The USS England came onto its attack course. The Hedgehog fired a salvo, and a few seconds later, a series of detonations resounded. A huge oil slick rose to the surface, and amidst the bubbles, sailors observed fragments of the hull. This was the second victory. The next day, May 23rd, almost in the same area, RO-104 was spotted. The scenario repeated itself. The submarine tried to escape into the depths, maneuvering, but the destroyer operated like a well-oiled machine. The sonar operator tracked the target. The captain accurately brought the ship into position, and the Hedgehog again unleashed its deadly salvo. 3 hits, and the Japanese submarine disappeared into the abyss. This was already the 3rd consecutive victory, and the crew felt they were making history. But the hunt didn't end there. On May 24th, they found RO-116. For several hours, the destroyer and the U-boat played cat and mouse. The Japanese did everything possible to escape, but at some point, the sonar operator confidently fixed the target. Another salvo, and again a series of explosions. Then an oil slick and wooden debris from the submarine's interior trim surfaced. The 4th victory. By this point, the USS England had become a true symbol of mortal threat to submarines. The United States command decided not to stop the hunt and sent the ship further, as the Japanese submarine line had not yet been completely destroyed. Soon they encountered RO-108, and the fifth attack was no less successful than the previous ones. The crew already worked together seamlessly like a single machine. The captain, officers, sonar operators, and the Hedgehog crew worked as if they had rehearsed every movement 100 times. Each salvo became a death sentence. Yet the culmination of this incredible campaign was still ahead. On the horizon appeared the sixth submarine, RO-105. A real hunt would unfold for her, involving several ships. But the final blow would once again fall to the USS England. The morning of May 30th, 1944. The waters of the Pacific are calm, but a deadly game lurks beneath these tranquil waves. American ships were hunting the Japanese submarine RO-105. Several escort destroyers pursued it all day, attacking with depth charges and hedgehogs, but the submarine persistently maneuvered, evading strikes like an elusive shadow. The USS England remained aside all this time. The division commander forbade it from intervening. Other ships sought to finish the job themselves, but the hunt dragged on, attacks brought no success, and patience wore thin. By evening, RO-105 unexpectedly surfaced directly between two American ships, blocking their fire. The situation was critical. The Japanese could escape. Then the division commander uttered the famous phrase, "Damn it, let the England go." The destroyer instantly surged into attack. Sonar operators quickly fixed the target. The captain brought the ship onto its attack course, and the Hedgehog salvo erupted. More than 24 shells soared into the sky, fell into the water, and a few seconds later the ocean exploded with a series of detonations. A tremendous underwater rumble rolled across the waves. A moment later, oil, wooden debris, and parts of equipment rose to the surface. RO-105 was destroyed. This was the sixth submarine destroyed by one ship in just 12 days. For the Japanese, it was a devastating blow. Their carefully constructed line of submarines, which was supposed to play a key role in the decisive battle, crumbled like a house of cards. The Americans not only foiled the Imperial fleet's plans, but also showed the entire world that submarines were no longer an invincible force. The USS England entered history forever. To this day, it remains a record holder. No ship in the world has been able to destroy 6 enemy submarines in such a short period. And all of this was made possible by the Hedgehog, a strange-looking weapon that even its own sailors initially mistrusted. When the USS England completed its hunt, the naval world was no longer the same. In the Atlantic, German U-boats increasingly fell victim to the Hedgehog. In the Pacific, Japanese submarines lost their chance to change the course of the war. The very appearance of this weapon transformed anti-submarine warfare from a blind game into methodical destruction. Now, a ship didn't wait for the enemy to dive deep, but delivered a precise strike at the moment the submarine was still in its sights. The secret to its success lay in the simplicity and ingenuity of the idea. The Hedgehog fired forward, creating a ring of death that trapped the enemy. One salvo decided the outcome of the battle. Sometimes, just 1 or 2 hits were enough to turn a formidable submarine into a heap of twisted metal, sinking to the bottom. For the Allies, it became a symbol of hope. For the enemies, a nightmare from which there was no defense. Yes, after the war, new systems were created, sonar technology improved, and more complex missiles and torpedoes emerged. But it was the Hedgehog that marked the turning point, after which submarines ceased to be the masters of the ocean. It is remembered as a weapon that flipped the rules of the game, and as a tool that gave the Allies control over sea lanes. The story of the USS England and its 6 victories in 12 days became a legend, and the Hedgehog itself, a true symbol that even a seemingly simple solution can become a deadly breakthrough. Germans and Japanese, accustomed to thinking of themselves as hunters, suddenly found themselves the prey. And this became one of those moments when the fate of the war changed forever.